Time like this, it would be best to drift off from the dark shore, alone under the clouded moon in an oarless boat, drifting away from what was or couldn't be, lying back on the rough boat bottom, looking up at the black sky, peaking stars, misted moon, the smell of fresh ocean growing stronger as you ride the soft current through the bay, out, past the blinking lighthouse, foghorn sounding, buoy bells clanging, the wind lifting, light spray, the boat bobbling, rocking in the larger waves. Drifting past all human sound into the mystery and peace of the sea, drifting in absolute abandonment like a tiny creature in a walnut shell on the broad rolling sea under the mighty sky, feeling the tingle under your back of the billion vibrations of life beneath you, feeling the movement of giant seaweed shifting in the current, hundreds, thousands of feet below the massive hum of life cycle, deep organ tones sounding through the boat, drowning thought, memory, drifting at last in the absolute knowledge of life and death, alone in the black of ocean, with the slap of waves, the whisper of spray, the glimpse of stars and moon, drifting toward that which is timeless, and you open your arms, you smile, embracing the sky, you glow and the clouds dissipate slowly, uncover the deep galaxies, the furthest stars shining, the ocean and the sky as one with the drifting, and like a snake skin, the withered rag of you, that petty thing outgrown, and your spirit expands luminescent and covers all and becomes all, the tiniest particles and energies of you flung instantly past light speed to the deepest corners of the universe, past the limits which don't exist, past calendar and birth and death, to the pulsing core and extremities of all, and it is one in the drifting, the abandonment, the tiny boat found charred and empty in the sea somewhere.
Oh.
Thank you everyone for coming today. My name is Chet Parento, and what I just read from was from a poem called Drifting, which was listed as a signature work back in 1979 when the founder of Stone Soup Poetry, Jack Powers, first wrote it and eventually had it collected in his, as of now, only full-length collection, Light from Stone, published in 1991. Today's purpose is to give a retrospective and a historical perspective to Stone Soup, a venue that was founded about 42 years ago by the late Jack Powers back on May Day 1971, which makes Massachusetts Poetry Festival and at this very week a perfect time to really do a retrospective. And I hope you get a lot out of this. For those of you who've been to the venue before, and even a couple of you who have rented the venue, welcome. This is as much for me as it is for you. I took over the venue back in 2005, and much of this history was given in an oral perspective. So I do thank Bill Perrault for helping us record this and giving us some documentation of this, because I'm going to be probably learning as much as all of you today. With me today on this panel are a series of individuals. The photos, I should say, most of the black and white photos come from Miss Julie Stone, who was very close to Jack Powers, still lives in Cambridge and Central Square today, and did much of the photography and the video in the 70s and 80s, and even occasionally in the 90s. Her work is currently trying to be restored, particularly the VCR videos, which include readings with a lot of figureheads in the world of poetry itself, let alone the Boston area. This picture by Julie Stone is of our first speaker. You can wave to the audience, Mr. Dan Shanahan, the author of the Alaska poems, the Crystal Lake poems, books that were published with the help of Jack Powers and his press service. He also has a broadside that will be available to everyone today. If we have time later, maybe we might even read it. very close to Jack Powers, as well as the second individual. For some of you who come to the venue, there's no introduction needed. He is actually at the venue on a weekly basis himself. He did a lot of projects with Jack Powers as well, including putting out anthologies of poems written by homeless individuals. This is James Van Looy. And stage right here is Carol Weston. I used to call her Our Lady Queen of Stone Soup, but she stopped that. But in love of her amazing modesty, I feel the need to mention it today. She has read alongside many of the figureheads of Stone Soup's history, and has held her own with the best of them. And she has many stories to tell as well. And some of you have actually, if you've been to the various local salons in the Boston area or the other readings, you've probably heard a couple, so this might be a chance to hear something new. And of course, none of us would be here today discussing this if it weren't for the efforts of Jack Powers, who passed away in October of 2010. And some other additional photos, again, all taken by Julie Stone, who is actually planning a book based on Jack's life and might actually be working with other individuals on, as of yet, unpublished or uncollected poems.
Is that one? Yep. Next one.
A little history of Jack Powers before I get everyone to comment, and please, I remind the panelists, the poetry, just as I host Stone Soup on a weekly basis every Monday night at the Out of the Blue Gallery in Cambridge, it's far better at night if I shut up and other people talk. So I remind the panelists to do that at any given time, and I'll sit down in a moment. The history of Jack Powers is that he was born in Roxbury, Massachusetts. He did attend Northeastern University, but articles from the Boston Globe show that he was only there for, I believe, one semester before venturing out on his own and trying to find his own way in the world, working in computers briefly for Mobil Oil. And he, most importantly here on the list perhaps, is his sojourn to California, where, as I believe the newspaper article put it, he discovered the horrors of Los Angeles and the joys of San Francisco. In particular, where he met individuals such as Lawrence Ferlinghetti and Allen Ginsberg, from which emerged lifelong friendships. Coming to Boston, coming back to New England in general, he had some time in New Hampshire, working as a newspaper reporter for a newspaper I believe is defunct in New Hampshire, before returning to Boston and beginning a lifelong goal of humanitarianism. One of his most high-profile jobs was becoming part of the Boston's business and cultural development. And Dan, I believe he worked under Mayor White, and then later on...
Actually, it was Kevin Flynn. Jack used to mourn the loss of the West End in Boston when Mayor Kevin White came in and changed the landscape of Boston. And
so what's the West End now to those of us who are
that's Cambridge Street in Boston. And Scully Square was there. The old Howard was there. Scully Square was a burlesque venue, famous. Many kids broke their virginity in places like Scully Square. It was old Boston, and all of that was cleared away in the
for things like the government center.
For government center, the new city hall.
It was Honey Fitz's old district,
Yeah.
which of course is the Fitzgerald in the John Kennedys, because the Kennedy father was married to one of the Fitzgerald daughters.
Yeah. So he was working. He spent 12 years in the Flynn administration, and many things came out of that. Jack was a social justice person and a poet, and he really was a social justice person working completely on his own. He started these free dinners and spaghetti dinners in churches and venues around Boston. The money came out of his own pocket. Spaghetti was like the loaf of bread that always kept breaking, and he could serve to other people. It was like the loaves and the fishes. But we were talking about it this afternoon. There'd be 100 people off the street that he'd feed on Thursday nights at St. John's, just down the street from the State House. And poets from Stone Soup would come in and read. He'd have musicians there as well. Go ahead.
Oh, no problem. Keep on going whenever you can interrupt me.
Yeah.
Some notable issues, and actually you'll probably talk in a moment again, because one of the notable accomplishments, according to a 1979 article, was his founding of the Beacon Hill Free School, which the article seemed to suggest that Stone Soup spun from that, but you were telling me earlier, James and Dan, that it was actually the opposite of that.
Yeah, the Beacon Hill Free School, which was on Joy Street in the old Hill House, Jack was actually director of that after Stone Soup had already started. The first time that I met Jack was I think it was like March in '71, and I was peddling a little mimeograph poetry magazine from Jamaica Plain.
Rock Point, I think?
Rockview, Rockview. And I was selling it for 25 cents on the streets of Boston at night, and Jack was outside taking a break from a poetry reading outside the Old West Church down the street from the State House and City Hall. And he invited me in, and there was a poetry reading going on, and he asked me to read. And then in May, Stone Soup started down at the art gallery right next to Buzzy's Roast Beef in the old Charles Street Jail at the end of Cambridge Street before
The Yellow Submarine Sandwich Shop.
that's right, and right by the Longfellow Bridge there, and it was a regular weekly session of poets would come in. It was very quiet and small, but sometimes we'd take poetry readings out into the street and welcome people into the session. And I think that was the real mission of Jack. He wanted poetry. If anybody had something to say, he wanted to make sure that they had a place to say it. And also to hear other poets do the same thing. And there wasn't any, it was the democracy of democratizing of poetry. It was no longer an art where we felt like we had to get a degree to do it. And that was, it wasn't institutionalized or it wasn't academically produced poetry. And he created a microphone for that, for people.
And it's got to be said that Jack Power's resume is a very long list of things, and he did a lot of work with the city of Boston. But for him, the working with politics and working in government was very much it wasn't so much because he had loyalties or affiliations. It was very much a means to an end for him.
Right. Yeah, it was a platform when he was working for business development and cultural development out of that office. He would have poetry readings on the steps of City Hall, and he would bring in musicians. So it was always, an opportunity for him to bring poetry and the arts, even when he was working for City Hall.
And it's amazing what he did. And the Beacon Hill Free School, I'll just point out, wasn't actually a school. I was under the impression that it was in the same location as Stone Soup was on 313 Cambridge Street. But it was actually a roving school of basically of classes by people held in each other's, apartments basically.
Right.
So Jack's was kind of a central area as well for that.
Right.
He also founded something that was called the Poetry Mobile, which I guess kind of lives on an idea with a group in Boston called Read Boston. It lasted, the Poetry Mobile itself lasted from 1976 to 1979, and its one purpose was to bring poetry to children. It was basically a children's literacy outreach. And Carol, did you say that Bill Barnum was part of that?
Well,
You have a picture of him?
I called up Bill. I said, Bill, tell me about the poetry. This was yesterday. Tell me about the Poetry Mobile. And is it true that you were lying underneath it? Yes, he said, it was very hot. But Jack happened to notice he was there. So all was well.
And now, as James put it, now we have 15 more minutes on the open mic at the end of every Monday still, because Bill is with us.
Yeah.
We'll show you pictures of Bill towards the end. He also founded with Concerts on the Common, and I believe one of the stories that, Dan, you said that was that it was high-profile acts and with poets as security guards.
Yeah. They hired us. Poetry. We were probably getting $250 an hour at the time, but You could see Chuck Berry, Bo Diddley, B.B. King, Richie Havens, Aretha Franklin for $2.50. And I remember Chuck Berry, Bo Diddley, and B.B. King were on one night.
Wow.
And who's the guy that wrote Maggie? You know, when he was
Rod Stewart?
Rod Stewart. He was there. Rod Stewart showed up. I mean, these are amazing acts. Jack was the project lead. He made sure that the city had the fences up and all the staging equipment was there. But what was amazing was that you could walk up on stage if you were a security guard, and you could watch Aretha Franklin in a reverie on the piano, where you could talk to Richie Havens, who just died last week, I think. It really was amazing. So he was all over the place. I mean, he was over 6 feet tall. He had this massive head of black hair. He had this big, I don't know if people remembered him or not, but he had this big leather satchel. It predated backpacks, I think. And he had everything. He always had poems and usually a can of beer. But he was also very sensitive. I think he fed more people in Boston than all the restaurants in Boston out of his own pocket. Spaghetti was, like I said, was a way for him to break bread and bring people together.
Even 30 years later, I was hearing stories about how Jack fed the homeless with his signature spaghettis. And Life from Stone, I won't read it now, but actually details just one example of how it can be made. And I guess didn't he use tuna as part of it?
Tuna, that's right. Tuna in the spaghetti.
The one story I'll pass down because I first heard it at his memorial when he passed away in October 2010. Somebody actually Jack was making this person a spaghetti dish, and he was vegan. He ended up Jack Parris ended up having a can of Velveeta. This is before it came in boxed macaroni and cheese dishes. But it was a can of Velveeta cheese. And I say the cheese in quotes because the individual said, well, Jack, I can't really have that if I'm vegetarian. He goes, okay, let's see if there's anything, let's see what's in the ingredients. And I don't know if this is true 20 years from now, but apparently they found out, yes, you can have Velveeta because there is no dairy in it. You see why I have to hold on. But moving on, just to touch back on all of this, this seems more like the journal of a humanitarian rather than a poet so far. Is that, well, really, as we were discussing before, Stone Soup, everything kind of wove from his work with the poor and the hungry to the poetry and bringing it to the common people. It was really all one and the same.
Right, and the word homeless didn't exist then. It wasn't. Well, some people called them bums back then. But the word probably existed in the English language, but it wasn't used back in the late 60s and early 70s. It was really for the poor, the destitute, the people in the alleyways, who the word got out in the alleyways on Beacon Hill, down in the alleyways off, what street is your church in? Tremont, down behind Tremont Street in the alleyways there were a lot of alcoholics and addicts were strung out along the alleyways there, and they would come into these places, and Jack would be feeding them. We'd be reading poetry, but we wouldn't have been there without him. He was the one who was making this happen. He was the center of this.
And you said he was the pioneer of urban gardening as well.
That's right. He started the urban gardening in Roxbury, where there were this wasn't a policy that had been established from City Hall or anything like that, but it was really about space management. And there are a lot of abandoned lots and buildings in Roxbury, and they started turning them into gardens. This spread out all over Boston and ended up, there was a large one out near, along the Charles River, where the TV station used to be, on the border of Watertown, Cambridge, and Brighton. That end of, near and bordering Newton, right up there at that end of the river. There was a large garden there that he started, and it's continued. I don't know if it was the first in the country, but again, this came out of his initiative, his idea. He might have taken the idea for somebody else, but he put the first shovel in the ground.
I'll never forget one time I was walking down Tremont Street. I saw Jack over on the corner of Boylston Street and Tremont Street. not far from St. Francis House. And the city guys were in there. They were putting in all these cherry trees. Jack was right there. He was involved in the whole process. He was actually working with them, all sweaty, all dirty. They planted all these cherry trees, which were from Kyoto, which was at that point our sister city in Japan. And those cherry trees are still there to this day.
Yeah.
Although they haven't fared particularly well because the winters have been hard sometimes.
Yeah. Now, he also, as part of the business outreach that he did with the city, what he did was that he would go to restaurants and grocery shops, and this is almost a common practice now in restaurants and in bakeries and supermarkets all over the place. He would get that, 1 or 2 day old produce and bakery goods, and he would collect that and make that available at these meals, and also give it out himself directly to people. So he was penniless practically. I mean, he did get a paycheck, but he didn't. It really was a loaves and fishes kind of event. How could he? You know what I mean? It really was. I mean, how did he reach so many? There was no internet. There were no cell phones, and there were no iPads. He was literally walking around, meeting people one by one, day by day, group by group. It was a lifetime of giving, and he couldn't stop. He couldn't not do this.
And he used posters, of course. He always had posters in his bags. He was always making up posters. And actually, that was just kind of a little art form that he did because he. That kind of tailored off over time when he got simpler with it. But originally, oftentimes, I mean, he would have artists who would actually come up with things. There was something called the sidewalk stethoscope. Do you remember that, Dan? Sidewalk stethoscope. And there were artists who would do cartoons and drawings and whatnot, and they would create broadsheets, and he would distribute these things, and he'd go around with them, and that was his way to attract people into the community. The crucial thing for any poor person, I think, is coming to terms with our own potentiality, because one of the most notable things about coming from a poor environment is the poverty of spirit.
I should say Jack Powers. Oh, my bad.
Yeah.
Now, as I said, this was everything he did in terms of working with businesses and working with this local government was just to achieve, his just to achieve his to achieve the ends, which was bringing people together.
Right.
Business was not the primary goal.
No, he had an art gallery here, all local artists.
And this is 313 Cambridge Street.
Right.
Still exists today. These pictures were taken by James.
And Mass General is behind there, and right to the left of that brick building is Buzzy's Roast Beef, which is probably gone now. And then to the left of that was this old 18th century jail called Charles Street Jail that was literally shaped inside like a birdcage. And Jack used to take artwork in there. And so that the prisoners could actually see that. We were talking about that this morning. But people would walk in off the street. I think we were still doing Monday nights then down on Cambridge Street. We might get 10 or 15 people there.
Carol, was Jack also involved in the prison programs that you and James have been active participants in?
Well, he wasn't able to get in.
I see.
But he always provided a place for Elizabeth Barker to come and to recruit people,
Absolutely.
which was a major factor
Yeah,
in
yeah.
how she kept a reasonable number of people going into that program. Elizabeth Barker actually was a very interesting woman from BU, who taught over there, and actually helped set up a whole massive program eventually that Silver actually went along with to allow college professors to go into the prisons, and unfortunately a lot of that's been rolled back because of all the restrictions and the increased security that has gone on for the last 25 years in our prison system, going back to Bill Perrault, I would say. And if you look at this picture, you can actually see, you could actually look at it and you can see there's a crease in the side of the building there, okay? You could actually look in there, and that the windows in the back rooms of the building actually looked out into this empty space that was in that building. And so anyway, Jack actually lived up there on the upper floors there. And then he would come down, and there were actual multiple businesses that were working out of the storefront. There was a moving company that worked out of there, Stone Soup Movers. Really, absolutely. And so there were all kinds of things and all kinds of different little people who were, part of this community, including homeless people. I remember there was a guy, what was his name? Something Bag Sam.
Sidewalk Sam.
Yeah. Which to Jack was this incredibly famous and symbolic character.
And Sidewalk Sam was famous for creating the illustrations in the walkway between Faneuil Hall and the North End, with all that redevelopment was going on and the highway was changing. And he did artwork himself and encouraged other artists to come in, and he and Jack recruited people for that as well. Jack also worked at the florist store in Faneuil Hall, right by Faneuil Market, near the Union Oyster House in Faneuil Hall. He was working all the time.
And he got me a job there for 3 years.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I worked with Jack there for 3 years.
Should also be noted, just as a quick aside, that Jack Powers also was an artist himself. He was very much a found artist, taking whatever he could find in the streets and literally putting it onto a canvas, even sometimes taking a bug shield, like window screen, and just attaching stuff onto that. I have at least one piece of artwork signed by him under the alias Jack Debris.
Debris.
What we're seeing here is not an exact Stone Soup location, but 313 was the original hangout, and as I understand, Harvard Gardens was just like the original, like after hours
Right.
place.
Right. That's where I decided I was, after a reading, I flipped a quarter and I decided, heads or tails, I was probably half cocked, but I flipped a quarter and I was either going to go to Ireland or Alaska. So it was tails and I went to Alaska. So
You lose.
you lose.
Didn't Jack also have at least one life event here?
Yeah, no, he had his wedding reception upstairs in the reception room.
Yeah.
And very sadly, at the end of Stone Soup on Cambridge Street, the party was held here,
Yeah.
and a beautiful, sad party.
Yeah, he got married at the Greek Orthodox Church over by the Fenway.
Yep.
Russian? Oh.
Yeah, Russian Orthodox Church, yeah. 3-hour ceremony, I remember. He has two sons, 2 living sons,
Yes.
Kolya and Andreas. And one is a troubadour. One writes poetry and sings his poetry, right?
He's actually come to perform for us a couple of times. If you YouTube Andreas Powers, you can find his work, him performing for our joint event for 100,000 Poets for Change.
And Kolya is a very interesting person, and he's wearing a cross, and I wonder, he's a mystery. His mother agreed.
Yeah,
Most mothers do think their kids are mysteries.
yeah.
Now here we have two other locations of Stone Soup. I believe at last count we had 13 or 14 locations over the 40-plus year span for Stone Soup, and this is actually the Charles Meeting House on the left. That was the first location that Stone Soup was sent to or relegated to.
And can I?
No, it's on
Yeah.
Charles Street.
Okay, at the Charles Street Meeting House, April 1st, 1973, Raphael de Grutla kindly brought me and John, and we were reading from a book, a new book that Raphael had published. No, that Raphael had Jack publish of the poems of the jazz poet Steve Jonas.
Oh, I have that. I have it here. I should pass that around.
Anyway, one of the poems. If that's
Garrett,
all right.
you wouldn't.
One of the poems of
Did you pass
Steve
that around
Jonas
to Garrett?
is, since he's the one that brought me together with Jack, I feel very indebted to Steve. And
Want to pass it around?
walk slowly, you above ground. Remember that I too bestrode like a colossus up and down the glistening earth and grasped the light and did him wrestle till the bell tolled the final round. So that's Steve, who came before, brought us together there inadvertently after his death.
Right. One of the things about Charles Street too is Jack would arrange for these street fairs, and he got permits for this, and it was literally like a carnival. He wanted to create a community atmosphere in the center of Boston where no cars were moving, almost like Faneuil Hall. So they sealed off from Beacon Street over to Cambridge Street, and people could walk back and forth. There were no cars there, but there were shooting galleries. We're shooting at little air guns and things like that, and throwing balls to win toys. But they also had a big platform there, a stage for poets to read, musicians to sing. And all of this was free. All of this was free.
Just to move forward a
Go
little
ahead.
bit, James, could you give us a little bit of continue on the photo tour? The
Old
photo on
West there, of course, many Stone Soup events held at Old West,
right?
which is on Cambridge Street, up the street from where the site. And then, of course, there were also events that were held at St. John's. For example, I always remember the counter-inaugural ball, which was held in early 1981 after the election of Ronald Reagan. We created our own poetic cabinet, and everybody read as a member of the cabinet for a counter-inaugural ball. And this is the Church of the Covenant on Newbury Street. He actually held a marathon there, went on for 24 hours. I think it was the first time I ever heard of that idea. And this is what is left of where Peter Piper Restaurant was. Another one of the locations that Jack managed to find port in for a few years on Massachusetts Avenue. And there were many locations like this. I can remember once we went to this place called the Maverick Bar, which was down near the financial district. For a while, he tried to see if he could get poetry readings going over by the Combat Zone, over on Washington Street, in a restaurant over there. And these pictures right here, this is Charlie's Tap over in Cambridge, which is where he was before it was at TT the Bears. And this one down below is at TT the Bears, of course, which was probably one of the longest running and most successful of all of his venues in the 80s and the 90s.
Those are all off Central Square in Cambridge.
Yeah,
right?
this picture is probably from about 1990 or so. And Julie Stone, who took a lot of these pictures, is actually there on the left with Jack in that picture. And there's a number of people who, some of whom, like Eric there on the right, are still around Stone Soup at
Eric
this
Nelson,
point.
Captain Cormorant
Yeah.
himself. Now, of course, Stone Soup has been host to a amazing amount of poets over the years. Some not shown or not able to be caught on camera or not found on film yet. Gregory Corso, Robert Bly. Others found on camera include. Oh my God! I just drew a blank on the name.
Is that Lynn Lipshin?
Lynn Lifshin, thank you so much. And one of the not as close up poets, Patricia Smith, who first started coming to Stone Soup in the I think in the mid to late 90s
No,
or early
80s,
90s.
yeah.
80s. Sorry.
in the 80s, early 90s.
I wasn't even in high school yet, so I'm not sure. But there are some figureheads that are synonymous with Stone Soup in their years. Their works come up every time I find an old Stone Soup zine. photocopied and held together with like one, maybe two staples. You know, it's amazing to find the work of poets like the local John Wieners. And this was
Can you
a
talk
very
a little bit, just a little bit about it, Jimmy?
Yeah,
Just
I
talk a
mean,
little
Jack
bit.
always had a relationship with John, and he always honored John, and he
Ah.
always put him, you know, as the seminal reader at event after event, and you know, kept trying to draw John out and to get him to read or do anything that he wanted. Actually, he would allow John to do just whatever happened when John came, and he just always continued to conclude John as a member of his community. As you can see in this picture, which was taken in the North End, you know, not that many years ago, even up until they were both getting gray in the beard.
yeah.
He was a teacher.
And John at the time was, you know, pretty much a recluse, you know,
Right.
because of past illness. I believe
Right.
you were mentioning a poem that John had referred to that and published in Stone Soup.
Yeah. I don't know if it was published in Stone Soup. I actually found that poem in a anthology, but John, of course, had been in mental hospitals and was given some of the harsh treatments of those days, and had been through a lot. On the other hand, he was a very brilliant man who actually was very much involved in the Beacon Hill Free School and all of that movement initially, and actually taught a class, the poetry class that they taught. He taught, and we actually do have a piece that he wrote about poetry in America at that time for that course.
Another figure is Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who definitely sends his regards. He's actually spoken with one or two of us regarding this presentation. Lawrence Ferlinghetti was very involved in Stone Soup, even going so far as to allowing Jack Powers to publish a broadside of one of his poems, Jack of Hearts, which was was attributed to be a poem about Bob Dylan. But James, I think you always felt that that it was kind of written for Jack as well.
It's definitely was about several different Jacks, probably, including Kerouac, of course. But this Ferlinghetti book here, actually, which is new, actually does contain lines about specifically about Jack. It mentions him by name.
To wit, in
So-
Catholic Church.
And Jack
yeah.
Jack often went out there to visit Ferlinghetti also.
Yes.
He would go out to San Francisco periodically and visit with him and stay with him. So they had a long relationship over many, many, many years.
And after a party at Julie Stone's, I was sitting in the front seat, and Ferlinghetti was in the back seat. And I said, do I have the strength? And so I turned around and I said, would you come and do a benefit for Jack Powers? And he said, yes.
Yeah, was this at the Arlington Church? Oh, Church of the Covenant, that's where we did this, yeah.
And actually, I was just reading one of the early Stone Soup publications, and it actually talked about how they were trying to get this money from the government to put out the publication, and didn't come through. And they were trying to do a project with Boston and New York writers together in one publication to make a larger community, which was what Jack was always trying to do, is create a larger community, a more inclusive community. And Ferlinghetti actually came up with the money to do that publication.
And this is a poster, obviously, for the 25th anniversary of Stone Soup that took place at the Church of the Covenant. And you'll see a couple of names there. One is Diana Jehovah-Neeson, who was an early reader at Stone Soup, very good friends with Jack. And then also Garrett Lansing is here, by the way, from Gloucester, who was very good friends with Vincent Farini of Gloucester. Vincent was, a figurehead in poetry, and he is They often name him the poet of Gloucester.
Mm.
I used to see him walking on the beach at Good Harbor Beach. He originally came from Lynn, right? Isn't that where he was born? Many of his beautiful poems about Lynn were published.
All the good poets are from Lynn.
And then John Voight was the librarian at Berklee School of Music for decades and decades and decades. And he often brought his bass and played at Stone Soup events. One of the early Stone Soup events was in the 70s, was a commemoration of Jack Kerouac at the theater, the Orson Welles Theater in Cambridge, before it burned down. And there were 500 people in the auditorium, in that theater. It was packed. And I was reading Visions of Cody by Kerouac. I was singing it in Gregorian chant. And John Voight, whose name is on the poster, he was playing bass. But that was in the 70s. We were doing Kerouac memorials. Yeah, 74, I think.
We should also say that Lawrence Ferlinghetti's friendship with Jack Powers, who's essentially a self-publisher, what they call a zinester now. When Jack Powers had the motivation, and he always had the motivation, but he was always doing for other people. And when he finally had other people to support him and get the books together, one of the people that he published was Lawrence Ferlinghetti.
Mm-hmm.
And oddly enough, Lawrence Ferlinghetti always offered to publish Jack. Jack Powers could have been a City Lights author.
Oh, can I?
Oh, absolutely.
This is what sorry to interrupt. This is what Ferlinghetti sent to Julie at the time, just after Jack died, and it says Lawrence Ferlinghetti was 91 years old and had just come home from the hospital after receiving a new pacemaker. But this is what he wrote. Born in the projects of Roxbury, Jack Powers graced many lives, working out of the mayor's office, feeding the homeless, running Stone Soup bookstore, and then carrying on Stone Soup poetry readings all over town for over a quarter of a century. He himself was a great poet with a fine voice, a great yea-sayer, a great lover of life, living it to the fullest until it overflowed with the curse of the Irish.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This one needs almost no introduction. Well, you have the name Allen Ginsberg on the side, and he was a very large figurehead in the world of poetry and the counterculture. Carol, who was the name of the Russian poet that's on?
Vosnesevsky.
Yes.
Yeah. Elizabeth McKim was doing her first feature reading at 313 Cambridge Street, and she said Vosnesevsky walked in. He said, he came to find out what American poetry, what was going on in American poetry, and he smiled as she read.
The poet, say his name one more time?
Vosnesevsky.
Vosnesevsky was actually a poet expatriate. He was actually arrested in Russia for the poems he wrote and actually recited. So he basically came one night to see what it was all about. So he wrote a lot of protest poems against that government. I've been trying to locate him. He seems to be. Wiki says he's still alive, but where he is exactly now, I'm not sure.
And I called. John, the person who took the photo of Ginsberg, Elsa Dorfman. I said, Elsa, please, I think on the 3rd of May, we need that photo, life-size, of Allen Ginsberg that you took. He had no clothes on. She said, it's in storage and it's terribly frail. So that she wouldn't let us.
Didn't he first do this? Didn't Ginsberg first do this in Manhattan? Carrot, do you remember? when Ginsberg took off his clothes at a poetry reading, wasn't it in Manhattan? Wasn't it in New York?
A
Couple of times, I see, yeah.
I think he did it once more for this promo. I think this might be the actual photo.
Oh, okay.
But I won't tell you how I know. I'll submit this to highlights next month. Now, before we go to some other figureheads like the late Brother Blue, this is someone who also passed away recently, Jack Powers. He passed away before Jack Powers, actually, and Jack went to his memorial service. Brother Blue, for those of you who weren't fortunate enough to have ever heard him, was the seminal storyteller. You know, by the time I had come to know him, he had his own venue, also at the Isle of the Blue, but he had performed at Stone Soup so many times.
Wasn't he? He was a minister.
He was a minister, but he was also a professor too at Harvard. And that's something I wanted to, I think we've discussed already, but there seems to be between Jack Powers and his friends and Allen Ginsberg, it seems like Jack Powers and Stone Soup Poetry kind of provided a bridge between, the street level of poetry that we've been talking about all this time and academia.
Right.
I mean, do you think that was unprecedented for its time, and do you think there's an equivalent today?
I don't know if it was, I mean, Stone Soup was original in many ways. I think the qualities, many of the poets that came into Stone Soup and read there and stayed there for a long time actually became, really great poets.
To me, what happened was
yeah.
that there was a real division that took place in our language and in our culture between the spoken language and print technology and the literary tradition, which became very much, and if you think about the poetry of the first half of the 20th century, is very based in print technology. And starting in the 1950s with the whole beat movement, there was this whole thing of doing the spoken word, of performance poetry. And it grew and grew and grew, and Jack was a major sort of entrepreneur of mining that whole thing, and he was somebody who's generationally sort of stood on that liminal line, as it were, between the spoken word and the literary word, and the print word, the word on the page, and so he was able to really appreciate and somehow hold within himself a love for both of those things, and to I think, and therefore develop what we have come to know as the poetry of the late 20th and the early 21st century here, which is very, very much a combination of spoken word and print literacy.
But originally there was, in the very early 70s, there was this division. It was almost the Charles River was the division between the street poets, so to speak, which we were viewed as kind of like street poets, and then there was academia, the Ivy League type of what Jimmy is talking about. I think there was a certain type of poetry, and I think American poetry in general has always strived to break a mold and to find new ways and new forms, new idioms. I know. Up in Gloucester, for example, there was Charles Olson. When you looked at Olson's poems and Creeley's poems and many of the people who were influenced by them, the whole meter and presentation of poetry was punctuated by breath as a result of letters between Creeley and Olson. And in Stone Soup, it was, I think, the spoken poem what was present, where you put your whole body into the microphone, and people were performing poetry, not just writing it and speaking it. They were performing their poetry, which kind of took it to a new level. It's different kind of
People
thing.
like Bill Barnum and Brother Blue took that to its furthest place with the physicality of their performances. And both of them actually are people who were physically trained. They were physically trained as actors.
And possibly James Van Louis could be included.
Right. Yeah, Jimmy and I and Carol as a direct result of Jack's influence. We used to have poetry readings up at the Ipswich River Wildlife Sanctuary every season. And Carol would read a poem, and then Jimmy would mime the poem. My wife Carla would sing, and I would read a poem. Then we had a harper there from Cambridge, and it was
Wonderful musician she was.
She was, yeah. So it's a combination of music, poetry, mime, meditation, writing, and reading of poetry. But all of that came out of that never would have happened unless we had had Stone Soup as the root. Yeah.
So here's some photos. We've already heard about the legendary Bill Barnum early before seeing a picture. As you can see, the legendary Poetry Mobile nap timer. He just looks like the story suits him. But no, he is actually, then and now, we showed a lot of people who are no longer with us or no longer with Stone Soup for obvious reasons, but there are several people that if you were to come in on any random Monday night, such as this Monday night, where we're to be celebrating the 42nd anniversary of Stone Soup, you will see individuals like Bill Barnum, who performs on a regular basis, not just at our venue, but for several venues. He is a machine. What recently described in a paper as a poetic phenotype. Just one of the many titles that he deserves.
Anybody in this room seen Billy Barnum?
Sure.
He's just this he's just a presence, a mystical presence, a beautiful soul.
And he was recently taken ill with pneumonia late last year, which prompted Stone Soup co-host Michael F. Gill, who cannot be here today, to actually start a series of interviews. And hopefully these will be available in transcribed text, and hopefully I'm pushing for audio as well, so they can be for archives. Because any one person who comes to Stone Soup, which is why the dais here is, who I selected, is that every person who's come to Stone Soup or has been in the scene for a length of time, has a wealth of history in and of themselves, and you could catch that any time you come to the venue. And if any of you have not gone yet, I encourage you to do so anytime. And of course, a quick mention here of Mr. John Voight, who is jazz bassist, and he's performed for us several times, even over the last few years. Seen what Jack Powers had left with a photo by Julie Stone. I think David Gee took the recent picture, not recent, but about 5 years ago, for a raffle holiday fundraiser for the Art of the Blue Art Gallery, and most notably alongside Carol Weston with an amazing performance of Peacefire, which I'm also hoping to make available, both the audio video from the 40th anniversary celebration and as an individual chapbook by Carol. These are just one of the many projects we're going on. One of the things that has just been mentioned on but should be explored even more is that Jack Powers, I think at his last count, published nearly 100 full-length collections of poetry by various poets besides himself, and published a number of journals, from the Stone Soup Gazette, which was an actual newspaper fold-out, a la American Poetry Review. We'll just say they ripped off Jack. And the Stone Soup Gazette, all of which was published under his Stone Soup Press. We recently came out with the now available Stone Soup Presents Fresh Broth, which is a continuation in honor of him, although we have retired the name Stone Soup Press in his honor. Now, I've asked this as kind of a semi-rhetorical question before the talk, but do you still think that, given how there's so many poetry venues on a given night, and given how Slam has kind of taken, the street poetry angle of things to a new level, do you still think that Stone Soup still serves the same purpose that it did 40 years ago?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's what's changed about Stone Soup really are just the people that are coming through the door. But there's still people who have an impulse. They have a poetic impulse. They want to not only write poetry but speak it, and they need this outlet. And this is, I think, what is unique about Stone Soup, and it has a long tradition. I don't know if it's the oldest open mic poetry venue in the country, but certainly it's one of the oldest, one of the longest running open mic venues. And it's just what it is, I think. it's a community experience, and it's not a competitive venue. It's not a competitive venue, and there are certainly places for competitive venues, and you know, the Irish poets, the Druids, were very competitive. The Japanese poets had a centuries-long tradition of competing with each other and writing all kinds of poetry. And but Stone Soup was just always had this generosity of allowing someone to come up and to read, and people listen. And I think that's a real gift, and that came from Jack, and he was the one who taught us how to listen, no matter who was reading, or what type of poetry it was. There was an absence of judgment in that listening.
Full of appearance by Joanna Nealon, who was is our unofficial fifth panelist who could not be here today. But for people who are interested in getting more from Stone Soup, there are definitive archives at the Healy Library where the majority of the print is gathered. You have to call ahead to get an appointment, but great deal of all the print collections, including chapbooks, full-length collections and papers, are available there. The University of Buffalo was helped set up by Jack Powers and Julie Stone, and that comprises just a small fraction of the cable shows that were produced from a very limited set of time. There's tentative sites to be set up in potentially UMass Lowell, but also maybe one or two other locations for the videos that Bill Perrault has taken since I think the late 90s or early aughties, and he's contributed quite a lot of his own time doing this, and I thank Bill for recording today's panel for everyone who said they want to make it but were on other panels or were just too far away. And also, a little Easter egg, Jack Powers' Jack Debris work is also currently being stored in the community church in Cambridge, on Cambridge Street in Alston, Mass, and we'd love to find a place for that too. I want to thank everyone for coming, but before we go, I wanted to close off with this poem by Jack Powers as recited by Carol Weston.
Well, the first thing I wanted to do was a little part of The Small Certainty. On the back of his book, The Small Certainty from the 1990, the ideal artistic life fuses an energetic inspiration with a sense of social responsibility. And then this poem. This poem is from The Inaccessibility of the Creator by Jack Powers. This fire. No one wants the heat of this fire. No one wants to burn alive. But that's where I thrive. At the absolute of ever, never hearing never, always feeling what is alive. Jack, where are you?
Thank you all very much. Thank you all very much for making this a successful first panel for Stone Soup Poetry. It's my hope, and it's the hopes of everyone else now. We convened a couple hours before the actual talk, and we enjoyed this so much. We're definitely energetic to produce more of these, and maybe have more than one of these in the Massachusetts Poetry Festival next year. And whatever feedback you guys can provide, I don't know if they don't exactly have review sheets or anything like that, but your support and just being here for us in general is, we're very grateful for this, and hopefully we'll see you next year with maybe new panelists, new topics, and I don't know if we have enough time for questions.
We have to.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay, so,
There's nobody else now.
yes, on time by attrition, no, this doesn't happen when I regularly host Stone Soup. Okay.
Yeah.
So, is there,
Danny has something here.
Yeah, I just wanted to hand out these, this poem, which was published by Stone Soup in the Alaska Poem Collections. And it was dedicated to Rose and Joe Dunn. And Joe and Rose were, Rose was a musician, and Joe was a poet who actually studied with Charles Olson and the Black Mountain Poets, and then came to Boston and was early involved in the early days of Stone Soup. I can remember being on the swings up on Beacon Hill and with a half-gallon of wine with Joe and I trying to kick the moon with our feet in that little schoolyard on the swings. And Joe died in the 90s. He was very involved in theater up in Newburyport, and we scattered his ashes out by Newburyport on Plum Island. But I wanted to make a gift of this poem. It was to Rose and Joe. Don, you can just pass them around. Thank you.